Black culture during the Harlem Renaissance. Hi, my name is Aghil Pullukalayil and I'm the president of Beat Movement Dramatic Syntax. And this is my activity theory for Maya Angelou. We all decided to just talk about the Harlem Renaissance. Our group has chosen to focus on the Harlem Renaissance. One modern poet who I consider that can convey the feelings of the people during this Renaissance was Maya Angelou. Maya Angelou is an American poet, singer, memoirist, and civil rights activist. Although she has a wide variety of talents, her poems are what stick out to me. Her poems are able to convey very powerful emotions, and those emotions can relate to the Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural explosion made by African Americans in New York City throughout the 1920s. It gave African Americans a platform and an outlet for new experiences. They created a whole new and vibrant culture through plays, art, music, and more. African Americans had their own culture, and it was unique and fun. It paved new opportunities and paths for others to pursue creativity as black men and women. Maya Angelou in On the Pulse of Morning talked about lifting their faces and giving them hope despite their past. That can relate to the Harlem Renaissance because despite their past, they were able to create a new, vibrant, and beautiful. Maya Angelou, a modern poet, expresses her feelings as an African American woman through poems that can relate to African American experiences during the Harlem Renaissance. African Americans have been oppressed by whites for a very long time. They never had a real chance to express their creativity in themselves. The Harlem Renaissance gave them that opportunity. African Americans created their own vibrant culture through a variety of talents. Claude McKay, a poet, wrote a popular militant sonnet called If We Must Die. Alan Locke was the editor of The New Negro in Interpretation. Aaron Douglas made illustrations for very important magazines, The Crisis and Opportunity. Marcus Garvey founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Duke Ellington took the genre of jazz and made it very popular. Maya Angelou was able to convey her feelings as an African American woman in woman work and how it was not easy. She puts in a lot of effort and has to put in more effort due to her being black, and she needed the storm to calm down and let her rest. This relates to the Harlem Renaissance because the storm can be interpreted as the racism, discrimination, and manipulation of white people, and the need for rest can be represented as the need to express themselves. Maya Angelou's poems were able to speak about the oppression of African Americans, which relates to the events that caused the Harlem Renaissance. African Americans are living much more freely than the past, but despite it being 2020, racism and discrimination continue to exist. Our current society is very hypocritical. Our society loves black culture, but there are a lot of people who do not love black people. Black culture has come a long way. Currently, a very popular music genre is hip hop, where the majority of popular artists are African American. Kendrick Lamar, Travis Scott, Future, Gunna, Lil Baby, Rick Ross, and Lil Uzi Vert are just a few names of African Americans who are very popular. In sports, African Americans are the majority. In the NBA, about 74% are African American. In the NFL, about 70% is made up of African Americans. Black culture is beloved by the majority of our society today, and it has come a long way, but despite that, African Americans continue to struggle with racism and discrimination. Maya Angelou in A Brave and Startling Truth talks about African Americans having the ability to fashion the earth. They have the ability to change the world to a place they can live without having to fear for their life. Today, they still have to continue to fear for their life due to racism and discrimination still being in our society. African Americans have had to continue, but they've continued due to hope. African Americans have made major strides, but despite their efforts, there are still those who continue to. Maya Angelou's poems reflect many young and old African Americans suffering in today's society. However, the Harlem Renaissance gave African Americans a vibrant new culture that continues to blossom.
Hi, my name is Brendan Domantay, and my AT branches are Community, Tools, and Rules, which means I am looking at the community of the Harlem Renaissance, the tools which are how African American culture was spread, and the rules were the people and culture that tried to limit the culture spread. The artist that I am focusing on is Alice Walker. She was born on February 9th, 1944, and she is still alive to this day. She is a novelist, poet, short story writer, and a social activist. Her works include Woman, The World Will Follow Joy, Turning Madness into Flowers, and her most famous book, The Color Purple. It shows what it was like to be an African American woman in the 90s and depicts abuse and discrimination that some African American women had to go through, and it rose awareness throughout the nation. The community of the Harlem Renaissance was New York, New York, and Harlem. The time period was 1918 through the mid 1930s. The reason for this movement was the free creative expression of African Americans. Discrimination and racism was large in many cities, including New York, so African Americans wrote plays and wrote poems, and were able to express themselves freely. This quote from The Color Purple reflects Alice's views on how hard African American women had to fight just to live. It shows how cruel the community was and shows how powerful those women were. It encouraged women that they had power no matter who told them they didn't. My thesis shows how Alice's work depicts women as strong people as they had to face many hardships and still push through them, no matter who was in the way. This quote reflects that Alice Walker believed that the power was to the people and that God was spread through word of mouth, just how culture and art was spread through the Harlem Renaissance. The poem Woman by Alice Walker is another example of how African American culture was spread, through the use of poems and books. This poem reflects how women were able to do the same amount of work as men, and that they could even do better at some instances, so they can make a better future for the next generation. My thesis reflects the power of the pen and how influential it is, not the pen itself but the work it creates, the ability to change how society thinks and inspire mass movements through the creation of one book or poem. Alice Walker's poem "The World Will Follow Joy, Turning Madness into Flowers" reflects the restrictions that being a woman had, and the racism that was directed towards the African Americans. It shows that they belonged to someone, and the only choice that they had was to keep moving forward. Alice Walker believed that the only thing that could break through the rules of racism was education. Education is extremely important and everyone should have access to it, even though there is segregation in many schools. My thesis explains some aspects of racism and the limitations it was placed on whoever it was directed at.
My name is Walter Campos, and the poet we are connecting to the topic is Gwendolyn Brooks. Gwendolyn is an American poet and educator. She won the Pulitzer Prize in 1950. The outcome is what the participants of the activity wanted to happen. In this case, the participants wanted the Harlem Renaissance to motivate African American artists and promote their work. Gwendolyn Brooks uses her talent in poetry to motivate the people of color, as she did in her poem Primer for Blacks. It is a guideline for the people of color to use as motivation and to boost their confidence. The thesis of this branch has my opinion regarding the importance of the movement and includes two of the desired outcomes that the participants wanted. Tools is asking what the participants of the activity used to carry the activity out. In the Harlem Renaissance, the African American people used their talents. Gwendolyn Brooks used her talent to show the life of an African American in short words. In her poem, We Real Cool, she shows how short the life of a person living in her community can be. The thesis of the tools branch includes my opinion of the Harlem Renaissance and two ways that the participants of the Harlem Renaissance did to carry out the activity. The object of the activity theory asked what was the reason for the activity to be carried out. The Harlem Renaissance was carried out because the black community felt that they were discriminated against and had no racial pride. Gwendolyn Brooks uses her poem Riot to show a way that a person of color can be easily discriminated against. She shows how a white person feels when they are near a black person. The thesis of this part of the activity theory has my opinion on what the people watching the movement could have felt. It also has two reasons for what the movement was carried out for.
I'll be presenting a poet from the 21st century. His name is Nnamdi Chukwuocha, and he is an American poet and a politician who focuses on the struggle and the social injustice towards African Americans. He presents his poems with his brother as if he was talking to him as another conscience. The first branch is the branch of ideas that are presented in the life of African Americans in the 21st century. Many African Americans are still being oppressed today, as in the 20th century. Many voices aren't being heard when they need to be. One example is Namdi's poem called Dreams Are Illegal. The poem is about an African American supposed to be living the American dream, until society outcasts them because of being in a neighborhood full of violence and terror. That's when society tells the African American society that dreams are illegal, but only for you. A second branch is the African American movement, or response to the oppression of society. It focuses on what makes them unique to the rest of the world and why it isn't something that anyone should laugh at or harass about. It is a way to counter the ignorance of society who turns a blind eye to the African American society. An example from Namdi is a poem called Hello Beautiful, where the poem is for the people who are feeling insecure about their looks due to their color and features. The poem tells these people to accept their uniqueness, as that's what makes one beautiful. The third branch is how rules play a role on an African American. Many African Americans are struggling either mentally, physically, or both, and have problems dealing with these problems. Some may break rules, and instead of society standing with them, society dehumanizes them and causes more pain instead. A good example is this poem called Monday Morning, which talks about how life is for a normal child with joy and happiness compared to a life of a child who experiences constant emptiness and pain. The child in pain doesn't have his mother for an entire weekend and has nothing to eat. The child had to go steal for his own survival, whose fault was not his own. He didn't have the opportunities to go to school that morning because he has to take care of his younger sister, who was in the same predicament as he was.